they get sick and tired of losing their bees, and then they just quit. And so we're just going to use the kids' curriculum. So I lay this gauntlet down in front of the old beekeepers who teach classes every year. And I say, if your beekeeping class is so good, then why do you have a 75% washout rate in 3 years? Because going, hey, this is a hive, this is a drone, this is a queen, this is a worker, this is, that's not going to help them at all. I mean, they need to know that stuff, yes, but unless they deal with the reason why they're losing their bees, it doesn't fix the problem. And they just become, well, I'm just somebody who knows well about bees. And they never become beekeepers, they become bee hatters. What typically happens is in the first year, they might lose their bees over that winter. Most of them is definitely the second year. And then they go on the internet and they say, I lost my bees, and you get a bunch of the crying and boo-hoo. And then they go, I'm gonna buy bees next year and I'm gonna do the same thing and think the outcome's gonna be different. I'm like, well, that's insanity. You know, and then I'm like, well, why'd you lose your bees? Well, I don't know. Winter killed them. That I'd say that answer, because they lost them come spring. So of course they say winter killed them. The interesting thing about that statistically, if you look at the loss of bees, and I looked at the numbers yesterday because it always changes a little bit every year. The commercial industry had a 65% winter loss. Hobbyists had closer to a 50. And in Saskatchewan and most of Canada, with their hard winters, they had 35%. So maybe it's not winter. Now, winter is typically the last stress that cracks open the cracks that they die on. It's the last thing. This is the stick that breaks the camel's back, but the camel was already dying before then. So if you say, well, why in the northern Canada, why do they have lower losses than Arizona or California? And there's a couple of reasons. One is they don't send their bees out to go pollinate fields. So every almond you eat, it was pollinated by a humming bee. Because if you look at those places, they have the almond trees and there's nothing green growing because they don't water anything else in California. So water is, it's limited. And then what they do is they bring in all these bees from all over the United States. Once the state apiary say yes, you can transport this, the beekeepers paid a flat amount for each healthy hive. They load them all in the truck. They show up there. The place is pretty much like a red light district of diseases. So like you have beekeepers who may not have healthy bees and they're bumping up against other bees. And so your bees come back. And the nice thing is that your bees come back because during the winter, they're at almonds. And then your bees come back after the winter, and you have all these beekeepers have all these hives that are full fresh of bees and resources, and they make out nukes and they sell these infected nukes to new beekeepers. Now, they don't do it intentionally, and not every nuke they sell is dirty, but the fact that they had no physical control over the quality of their bees because they were sent into the almonds is nothing that they can do about it. They've decided to live that lifestyle. And in Canada, they don't have migratory bee shipping kind of like that, at least not the level that we have. Some of it people will say, well, it may have something to do with the foraging, and that might also be true too. There might have something to do with the insecticides. Of course, these are all the things that Google or ChatGPT is going to tell you. My belief, and not that I agree with this, but in Canada, if you cannot do best practices and keep your healthy bees, you will have your license pulled and you can't have bees. Period. So that stress forces people into a situation where they have to take care of them properly. And I think that's actually the largest deviation. If I was to get on Facebook and you had a guy talking about his bees and I was to treat the bees as any other livestock, regardless if it was horses or birds or any of the rest of that stuff, or heaven forbid like children and that they killed them, I would be ostracized and kicked out of that message forum. But because they're just bugs, they're just bugs. And people, they don't take it seriously and they think, well, I'll just buy more next year. And there's also some beekeepers who've been beekeepers for longer than I have that think it's normal to buy bees every season, which it's not. The first thing you need to really pay attention to as a beekeeper is that you want to become sustainable. Now, you could go into a room of like 5 beekeepers and you could ask a question and you could literally get a dozen answers. because based upon if they're commercial, if they're sideliner, if sideliner just is kind of a smaller version of commercial, or if they're hobbyist, or how far they are north, how far they are south. I have a friend that lives on the other side of Iowa. When he starts doing things or what he does is totally different than me. And then they have their own personal ethos. Is it that I'm going to drop chemicals into everything, or is it that I'm going to have integrated pest management, and every time I stick my hands in a beehive, I will automatically assume that they have problems, and I will be working for that to work against those issues, which is primarily mites, every time I touch that hive. So we could have classes on mite control. We could have classes on all of this, and they would be relatively long individual classes, but I just want to touch base. I will come out and say that mites are not a treatment issue, they're a management issue. If you think you're going to treat them and that's going to take care of them, that is not going to work. Typically what happens, we'll go into the varroa mite here, but typically what happens is that people, they try to treat their hive late September, early October, but by then their hive is so parasitized with diseases that these mites bring in that they have this big strong hive and all of them are affected and they're already dead. They just don't know it yet. And people will, it's like if you have not treated your hive by the end of September, you have what I call a ghost hive. They're alive and fine and look great, but they're already so parasitized that they're dead once they get stressed out. So, but we'll go into that. The other thing that kills bees in the Midwest has to do with starvation, and then the next thing, I'd say starvation and varroa are pretty close first place, and the next thing has to do with the fact that bees, as they eat honey, they breathe off vapor, kind of like what you do if you've ever been in a tent and you've been camping and water's dripping from the middle of the tent because as you've been sleeping, you've been breathing. And you have to have a way to deal with that moisture. I don't have the slide, but there's a slide that I have that says for every pound, so many pounds of honey, they breathe off so many gallons of water. You have to have a way of getting rid of that. And what happens is that the cluster, which lives in the middle and kind of rotates like penguins to stay warm in the middle, up in the upper 90s where the queen is, once they get wet, all bets are off. They can't maintain that temperature. So, but we're going to go. So we're going to talk about what makes the honeybee unique. Life in the hive, honeybee treasures, and honey and problems facing the honeybee. 90% of the world's nutrition comes from crops pollinated by bees. And so the old, hey, just get off the message form and go back to your bees. I'm like, well, every time you're eating food, you need to realize that, hey, you're eating the effort of these pollinators. Now, they're as much as I like honeybees, European honeybee, known as Aphis malvaria, the carpenter bee makes the honeybee looks lazy as far as how much pollination they're doing. Carpenter bees will work. They will work the honeybees under the table when it comes to pollination. Another interesting thing is if you like tomatoes, if tomatoes is a big deal, the only bee that can get there is bumbles. And bumbles, because the anther is so far down the flower, what they do is they'll literally hang on the flower and they'll vibrate to the pitch of C, and they'll shake that pollen and everything on them. And so if you ever, I can tell you by kids who have gotten stung in the chest by bumbles who are typically pretty peaceful, that if you ever had to send them to go clean tomato plants and they're yanking them out too early in the season, you will violate their nest, and that bets all those nice fat little pandas that fly through the air that make no sense that they can actually fly, have a tendency to get really mad. And unlike honeybees, their stinger is not barbed, they can go multiple times. And so know your bees. We got honeybees, bumblebees, jerks with wings. It's typically going to be your yellow jackets. Frisbee, bumblebee, and wannabe. So this here is a hoverfly. And you can tell because he has a little antenna on the front and he has no. Bees have a thing on, and we'll have a better slide. Bees have a thing on their head that is, they have 3 oculi, which are simple eyes. They're shaped in a pyramid type. They got 1, 2, and 3. And they use that to navigate with the sun. With the 3 points, they can tell where they're located at. Hoverflies don't have that. And they hover, but you see them a lot on marigolds. They are still a pollinator to some extent, but they do mimicking. So we got the carpenter bee, you got the honeybee, you got the bumblebee, you got the hoverfly, you got the paper wasp, yellow jackets, cicada killers, and dirt daubers. Like I said, this is the slide we typically show kids. This is kind of their characteristics. Carpenter bee makes the honeybee look lazy. Honeybee, of course, the nest, and then they nest at the bottom. Tomatoes, bumblebee, hoverflies, just copycat. Leave my house alone, and I will not have any problems with it. Paper wasp, if they're not in a place of high traffic, I'll leave them alone. Gimme. There's a yellow jacket. Now, yellow jackets are interesting because throughout the season, the warmer seasons, they hunt. They're good. They hunt a lot of the worms, the caterpillars, and stuff on your garden. But the problem is, once they get ready to overwinter, and the workers do not, I believe, overwinter, they start going after sweet stuff, sodas, drinks. They will also rip through and destroy small beehives that are weak, that don't have proper entrance control. And so, if you decide to do open feeding, you'll have to deal with yellow jackets if you do it too early in the season for trying to put weight on your hive. Cicada killer is kind of the whale shark of the group. They're very peaceful. We used to joke that the cicada killer had a natural enemy called the wiffle ball bat, but they're really peaceful. And the problem is they're very big and they're loud, and people they get afraid. But really, you should just leave them alone. All I care about is my family and not fighting at all. That's the dirt dauber. They're really kind of hard to antagonize, and we allow them to live on our deck for the most part. So then there's the 3 caste system. There's the queen, the drone, and the worker. The queen will actually carry her wings and like a cape behind her. She moves differently. She has an entourage that feed her and keep her clean. And so when you're looking for her on a frame, you're kind of actually looking at how the bees are moving more than you're looking for her. This queen kind of has a small butt. A lot of my queens have larger, lower abdomens. And then you have the worker and the drone has the big eyes, and the reason the drones have the big eyes is because the drones have to be able to catch the queen mid-flight in air, and they have to be able to see her in order to mate with her. And so, interesting story. Well, I think we'll just cover the slide before I get there. We'll just slide do the work. So this thing is a velvet ant, aka cow killer. This is a wingless wasp and lives alone and wants nothing to do with you. Their venom is almost harmless, but the pain is really something. Males are not known to have stingers. So I see these guys running around all the time, the velvet ants, right? And so this is the male and the female of the group. And so common types of beehives. You have Langstroths. This is what you're traditionally used to seeing. We'll go into the breakdown of this one here. This is the thing that made beehives really useful is this stuff called bee space. And bee space is the space that a bee will move through without gluing things together. Once that was figured out, then all of a sudden removable frames became really common. If you have too much space, the bees will put wax there. If you have too little space, the bees will put wax there and maybe propolize it together. Regardless, that's the Langstroth is the common one. You have warm beehives. I really have not messed with those very much. This you can kind of see here where they've drawn out their own, foundation. So it's more something you see in Europe. I really have very little experience with them. This is kind of a fun hive. This is a Kenyan or top bar hive. These are kind of Chris wants one for her garden. They're kind of pretty. If you look at this, the bees will draw like a triangle, sort of, chopped at the bottom to fit in there. This is considered foundationless beekeeping. There's goods and positives. There's some negatives you have to be aware of, but we're not going to cover in this class. We're just going to cover the fact that it exists. And there's skeps. So this is typically what you're used to seeing, like on a honeybee bear box or something. The skeps. It is actually in the United States illegal to keep bees like this for the purpose of collecting honey, because you have to destroy the whole nest in order to get the honey out, because you don't have separate sections. So honeybee casts, you queen, worker, and drone. You got the worker here, the life cycle worker, aka the sterile female bee. So here's the thing. A lot of people, they give a lot of credit to the queen, but really the worker is really the amazing insect out of the hive. So day 1, the queen lays the egg, and day 4, the egg hatches, the larva appears, the worker is fed larva. So you see the guy with the little hard hat there? So I asked the homeschoolers, like, well, what are you supposed to do when you wake up? And this is really like a question you should ask Gen Xers, because little kids don't even bother with it. And I'm like, what? I'm like, oh, I have to make my bed. Okay, cool. So on day 4, when the bee hatches, he goes in and cleans his room, and then he becomes a nurse bee. His glands on his mouth, his mandibles, are capable of producing large amounts of royal jelly, and it is his job to feed the babies. And at that point, if you took a nurse bee and you threw her out of her hive, not only would she not be able to make it back, because she doesn't know where her hive is, she would not be able to fly. She doesn't know how to fly, and she doesn't know where the directions are. Okay, and so you have that type of bee. But there's the process. Basically, it's just telling you how the work caps and et cetera, et cetera. The problem here, and we'll show a video, during this portion, after the queen lays an egg that turns into a larva, everything in the beehive is done through smell, because there's no light. It's all pheromone driven. It puts off a pheromone that tells this guy, hey, come feed me and all this stuff. And right before he caps it, it puts off a smell that says, come cap me. At this point, you have these mites that smell that. They jump down in there, and then while they get capped, the mite reproduces down inside the capping. Okay, and that's the varroa mite. Now, there are other mites. There's trachea. But this mite is such a big problem that if we deal with this mite, it typically knocks out the other issues. Day 20, so as you can see, become the nurse bee. We just talked about that. And day 32, 40, they produce and build wax in the abdominal glands, allowing them to build a honeycomb. They seal the caps, so they become wax production. Day 4 through 43, guards protect the hive from most potential invaders. And day 43 and onwards, they're foragers until they die. So they actually have a work schedule that they go through their whole life. During this, also, they become undertaker bees. They go out and they clean the hive out. And so they have particular jobs that they do as they age. Honeybees are flying chemical plants. So we know that the bees produce poison. They have hairs on the leg that stack pollen. They collect pollen in their honey. Honey in their honey stomach. They temporarily store that nectar. When bees find a patch, they'll typically work that patch before they move on to another patch. And as the bee comes in, it'll do a little dance in reference to the sun. And if you're good enough, you can pay attention. You can find out where they're going. At that point, they try to take enough food to get out there and to come back. Okay, so they have stomachs for digesting their food, and they have stomachs for dealing with the honey. You have their proboscis. This is weird. This is one of the few insects that has mandibles and a tongue. It has a compound mouth. It's not very common. The compound eyes comprise of 7,000 different lenses. They have an antenna for smelling. That's how they smell. The 3 oculi, we just talked about that. They have these glands in their mouth that typically atrophy as they get older, that produce the royal jelly. So you think about it, bees can produce a thing called propolis, which is kind of like bee glue. It has very antiseptic qualities. They can produce propolis, they can produce honey, they can produce venom, they can produce wax, they have their own pheromones, they can produce royal jelly. So there's 7 different chemicals right there. So they're flying chemical plants at that point. So this is some of the stuff: the wax, the bee venom for apitherapy, propolis, royal jelly, bee pollen, and honey. And so there's the beeswax. There you can see it. It's underneath the segments of their body. Beeswax, typically you need to be up in the upper 90s so they can take it and they can form it, because it does harden, if you've ever done beeswax before. So this isn't one of my frames, but this is kind of what I do. This is on a deep frame. I use mediums, which are a lot shorter, but as you can see, this frame does not have a foundation. Okay, so basically it looks, and this is kind of gets important. This is how I keep bees. Emphasis on the word I. It looks like that. It's just going to be like a picture frame, right? And so One of the things though is if you provide the bees with something to hang off of, this is a modified plastic frame that I just grabbed out of the yard real quick before I came down here, like that, or if you have a taper, which this is my preferred, I thought I had a taper. This has a wooden taper that V's out. The bees, if they have a level hive and based upon their genetics, will draw their own beeswax. There's no foundation on here. This is like the worst example I have of this because I use all my wax for making candles, so I don't keep it very long. Or when I destroy my wax when I collect honey. And as long as your hive is level, left to right, they will do like a plumb bob. They'll hang down like a plumb bob and they'll draw the wax vertically. Now, some genetic bees and some strains of bees, they don't follow this rule at all and they just kind of put it everywhere zigzag. And a lot of the people who do foundation type beekeeping will say, well, that's because you're foundationless, but I can tell you, I have seen zigzags on foundation. This is what's called plastic foundation. I don't use this, but this isn't a bad alternative. But the thing I don't like about it is that if you look at all these little cells, the cells determine what gets laid in there. So smaller cells will get a worker bee. But the larger cells, they'll put honey, and the larger cells, of course, because the drones are larger, they get put. So the queen doesn't even determine what she lays. If the workers do what's called drone cells, then she lays drones, and if they do worker cells, then she'll lay workers. The thing is, and here's the deal, we've been playing with bee size since the 1800s. So what they try to do is they're like, well, we're gonna push these bees to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the problem with that is that maybe they don't fly out as well. But I can tell you that the gestation period that a larger bee takes to hatch is longer, and that gives the mite more time to reproduce in that cell, because we'll go through a video on how that happens. So I do what's called natural cell, is that I allow the bees to determine what they build and when they build it, and I don't determine what cells they build. So I'll have some frames that are chock full of drone. If you look, you can kind of, since there's just the two of you, you can kind of look, there's a big difference in size between that octagon and that octagon. This is drone, okay? And this is just worker. And so you can put a 32 in there. And this is closer to smaller, like a 22. So, and the thing is that a lot of the commercials, now here's the thing, as I do not recommend as a hobbyist beekeeper using the dogma of commercial beekeepers, because you have a lot more time and flexibility, they don't. So commercial beekeepers, whenever they see drone cone and say, they don't want it. Because in their mind, they're thinking, well, this hive is building drone cone, and rather than laying workers, they're laying drones, and they're using up resources. They're using up food, they're using up space, they're using up all this stuff, and they just want a honey production because it pays for their bills. I understand, I'm not giving them more time. But here's the thing, if you put a frame in like this, and a hive that has all been full of workers, the very first thing they'll do is start building drone cone. Because they want to reproduce and they want to spread their genetics. In order to do that, they have to have boy bees, which are drones. With that being the case, and I'm not going to get too far down this rabbit hole because, like I said, we got a whole separate class on it. You can force them to build drone, and then you're like, well, why would they want to build a bunch of drone? Because the varroa might smell drone differently than they do workers. And they prefer to go into drone cells because they take a longer time to gestate. So it's a better environment for them. So if you were to put a frame in there, it gets all built up, it gets capped, and you came back in an amount of time, you could pull that frame out, and basically you'd freeze it, you'd kill everything in there, and it would impact your mite count in your hive, it'd lower it. So it'd be like a trap. So this here, I played with it. It really requires too much me being in the hive and out of the hive and in the hive. Some people use it. I mean, it's not as a hobbyist, I say, play with it, see how it works for you. I don't like killing bees, and it's just required me to the problem is though, if you leave one of these in and you forget you have it, once all those drones hatch out, now you have a mite bomb because you didn't pull it. So bees don't take a lot of time, but they're very much, you can't procrastinate where you got more problems and then you can't fix it. It's like dominoes. Once the issues happen, they start going downhill. So, but that's what this is called festooning. That's what they're doing in this picture. The reason it had wires in it is because that person, I do crush and strain, but he does a traditional where they cut the cappings off and they spin it in a centrifugal force spinner and then they collect it. And the wires help keep that wax because it doesn't have a hard foundation together. So it doesn't blow out while they're spinning and create a mess. You can see this is foundationless. This doesn't have a foundation. One of the things, the reason I do beekeeping foundation, there's a lot of reasons, foundationless, is that in the late 90s, early 2000s, and actually the problem started happening in the 80s, varroa mite showed up and people dropped a bunch of chemicals into their hive because it's their livelihood. Okay, I'm not going to be judgmental, but that's what they had to do, right? And because they were trying to treat it as they've treated all the other problems up until that time, because this was a new monster to them. When you get traditional foundation, so what they do is they'll pour wax foundation like this that goes in there. I don't have any to show, but that wax that gets used is the cappings that commercial beekeepers take off their frames. And what happens is they were doing it over a period of time. Well, the problem with wax, it's a lipid, it's a fat. It stores things very well. And you started having high levels of concentration of miticides showing up in beehives that never use miticides because all their foundation was this commercial concentrate. And you ended up having queens go sterile and ended up causing all these other problems. And so I just screw it, I'm foundationless. There's a gentleman in Neha, Nebraska. His name is Michael Bush. He is the premier beekeeper on this type of beekeeping. Some people call him the organic beekeeper. I've been to his a lot of his talks and stuff. He has an awesome website. He has a really thick book that you can read, but all the stuff's on his website. I highly recommend you look up Michael Bush Bees in Neha, Nebraska. He just happens to be a local for us. I don't recommend him because he is local, but he's really that good. So you can eat wax, of course, if anyone's ever done this as well. And then, of course, there's beeswax and different uses. The next product is bee venom. Some people I get stung because I don't wear gloves and I control the quality of my genetics that if they act stupid, they get fixed. I get stung probably about 6-7 times a year, and most of it happens in the dumbest time. Someone said, what's the most surprising thing you would say as a beekeeper that you never thought about that you have to deal with? I would say you will not realize how much time you spend working bees at night. The problem with bees at night is they don't fly, they crawl. And that's awful because that's how they get in places you don't want them to get. So most of my stinging either is going to be when the bees don't want me there, which is going to be cloudy days during the night, or stupid times in the winter, which is just sometimes trying to rush in and out of there. Bee venom therapy has been used in Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, lupus, and Lyme disease. It creates an immune response. It creates a heating up, circulation starts taking off. If you get stung, so this, like I said, the slide's for younger kids. Don't smack the location of the sting. This will inject the poison like a syringe. Remove the pump and poison sac. So actually, if you get stung and you sat there, you'll see the bee walk off, and you'll see that muscle doing this. It's pumping it in. You just take your fingernail, pop it out. The problem is, what else is left on there is a pheromone that tells every other bee, hey, sting them there. So when I'm beekeeping and I get stung on the hand, I rip it out, and then I take my smoker and I smoke it, cover it with smoke, and go back to work. You remove the poison sac, cover or wash the location of the sting to remove the attack pheromone that's left behind. Seek treatment, use Oragel, any local painkiller, Benadryl. Monitor breathing and heart rate for anaphylactic shock. Some people do go into shock. So there are some beekeepers that have 2-PAM chloride, right, the military, but they have the injectors. I can't think of the proper term now. I'm thinking of this stuff from the military, but you have the injectors that they use. EpiPen, thank you. And now they've gotten cheaper, so it'd be nice. Here's the other thing, is that if you are someone who works next to a beekeeper and you never go out and get stung, your contact on just having poison rubbed on you creates a T cell reaction in your body that when you get stung, there's a possibility that you will overreact because it's been building over a period of time. So a lot of times children of commercial beekeepers have to pay attention to that or get stung every once in a while. It's not a big deal. So there's propolis. This stuff's actually pretty cool. Propolis or bee glue is a resin mixture that honeybees produce by mixing saliva and beeswax with gathered from tree buds, saps, willows, basically places that if you ate it, you would be sick. Other botanical sources is used as a sealant for unwatered open spaces and hives. Propolis is used for small gaps, while larger spaces are usually filled with beeswax. The colors varies depending on its botanical source, with dark brown is the most common. Propolis is sticky at and above 20 degrees Celsius, while at lower temperatures it becomes very hard and brittle. I have had bees. I typically keep Russians and Carniolas because of their overwintering properties, and I'm just kind of used to how they act. If you never had Russians before, they kind of freak people out because they have some characteristic traits that aren't common, or not as often common, I guess I should say. But I've had bees almost cover the whole entrance up with propolis. They're like, screw it, we're not waiting for you, winter's coming, and I see that, I'm like, crap, this winter's gonna suck. Another thing that I want to point out is that winter is not as big as a factor as people like to say. I have kept 2 boxes of 8 frame mediums, which is what this is. So to figure that much, overwinter a hive in negative 42 degree temperatures, wind chills. They were just ready to go. They were ready, they were prepped, everything was good to go. So typically when I lose bees, it has to do with bad preparation. And then sometimes you just lose them and you do everything and you lose. But normally, if you pay attention, you'll know why you lost them, or you'll have a good guess. So here's their little chicken legs bringing in propolis. This stuff has a high antiseptic quality. You can buy propolis for your throat sprays. You can take it as a pill. Thousands of years ago, ancient civilizations used propolis for medical properties. I do not harvest it. I really need to. I can tell you there's probably, where are you, little buddy? There's a little bit on there. It will always be on the frames because they'll glue the frames to the side of and they'll glue the you can, it's on here. It's not wax. You can actually, that's propolis. What's interesting is that if you ever taste this stuff, you would think it tastes very chemically. It's like Hall's methylatum. It's very, of course it matters where they're getting it from. But it's really, there are people, there's ways to harvest this, and I'm really kind of waiting. It's a value added product for beekeeping, really, if you want to make the most money out of it, something you should think about. Anyway, so the Greeks used it to treat abscess. The Syrians put it on wounds, tumors to fight infection, and helping the healing process. The Egyptians used it to embalm mummies. Researchers have identified the 300 compounds of propolis. The majority of these compounds are forms of polyphenols. Polyphenols are antioxidants that fight diseases and damage in the body. Hives that are made from rough cut lumber are like all rough on the inside, and the bees will typically coat the inside with propolis, and their hives are typically more healthy. They deal with bees get sick, they have diseases, they have issues as well. And so this is propolis here. You can, like I said, there's a few different products you can buy on Amazon if you like. Bee glue and antibiotic. This is the stuff that gets on your steering wheel, it gets on your gloves, gets on your hive tool, it gets on everything. And it just sticks like glue. It's not like wax. Wax is very easy to remove. Matter of fact, the only time I wore gloves for a while was to not have propolis on my hands. Royal jelly. Royal jelly is a honeybee secretion that is used in nutrition of larvae and adult queens. It's secreted from the gland and the hypopharynx of a nurse bee and fed to all larvae in the colonies regardless of sex or caste. Queen larva in the cell on a frame and bee, sex or caste. Queen larva in a cell on a frame with bees. During the process of creating new queens, the workers construct special queens. Okay, so all bees get fed royal jelly. The queen gets fed royal jelly for almost all her life, and that creates a hormone response. So the only difference between a worker queen, a worker bee, and a regular queen bee is the same larva. They're the same egg. The difference is in the cell that they raise them in and how long they get fed this royal jelly stuff. If you have a hive that goes queenless and they can't reproduce a queen, the bees, and there are a lot of people who believe in a higher creator because they're beekeepers, the bees are doomed. They can't reproduce, they can't do any of that. So what they do so they can move their genetics on is that the worker bees will realize, hey, there's not fresh brood that is putting off this hormone. We're missing a queen. And over a period of time, they'll start laying eggs, even though they've never been mated. But the eggs that they lay are just men. They're just males. They're just drones. So you get all these drones. So the drones can go and mate with another queen, and they can pass the genetics of that hive on, even though the hive is dead. Okay. And we have to remember that the stinger of a bee used to be a reproductive organ, and it was changed and moved into now being a stinger. So there's a lot of this intelligent design stuff going on. Anyway, so during the process of creating new queens, the worker constructs special queen cells. The larvae in these cells are fed with copious amounts of royal jelly. This type of feeding triggers the development of queen morphology, including the fully developed ovaries needed to lay eggs. The worker bees are just sterile queens. They have ovaries, but they're sterile. They don't reproduce unless they're laying drones. So this is what a queen cell looks like. You can buy royal jelly, and this is just her, and she just keeps eating it and going around and eats it up until she's ready to hatch out. The other thing as a new beekeeper is you want to figure out how you're going to deal with mites, and you want to figure out how you're going to make more bees, because 50% loss is pretty bad among beekeepers. But the thing is as people who typically educate on bees, they don't focus enough on becoming a sustainable apiary, and that should be the first thing that comes to your mind. This needs to be sustainable, and then the honey needs to be what I'm going after. So that's a queen cell. That's one of my first attempts. There are many things you can do to facilitate a hive to produce queens. Most hives will produce queens under certain situations. One, if the queen has performance issues, if she's not laying well as she's older, she carries that spermacia in her body for a long time. I can't remember the 3 years, the lifespan of a queen. I can't remember. Don't quote me on this. Someone's gonna watch the video and I'm like, that's not it. But I manage my hive so much that it's not even really a deal I'm concerned with. And then, so you have performance issues. If she gets damaged, if she gets hurt. The other thing is that the way bees reproduce, because they're a super organism, is the way that it works is that once the nurse bees, once they have no more work to do, there's a lot of things that can trigger why a hive does this, but one of the most commonly beliefs is that if there's no more work for the do, because you have this huge packed hive, so there's no places for them to make new places and stuff like that, what they'll do is they'll start making these cups for the queen to lay into these cups. And once the cup is laid into, they'll start drawing it out. And so at that point, they'll start chasing the queen around the hive to make her thin, to make her light, to make her ready for flight. And then when she's ready for flight, scout bees will go out to find a suitable location for them to go to. All the bees that can fly gouge themselves on food, on honey, so they have wax they can make because they need the honey to make the wax, so they take a large portion of your production when they swarm out. And then once the scouts go out, then the queen goes out, all the adult bees that can want to go out, there's some things that trigger who's what, and they'll take their honey and they'll go with you. Now what will happen, in the bottom of the swarm frame, you'll see all these little cells, not cups. There's a difference in terminology. Bees can make cups with no eggs in them. Russians keep cups all the time. I jokingly say because they're always getting ready to secede each other. They're always getting ready to uproar and kick their, cut the czar's heads off or whatever, right? Italian bees, they like to rob a lot, and then you can make a lot of these jokes about, and I'm not going to do it, but a lot of jokes about the different type of bees. What happens is the first bee that hatches, if there's multiple cells, they will go through, the first queen that hatches, she's not mated yet, but she'll go through and she'll kill all the other queens. She'll put her stinger right through that wall and kill them. And if another queen hatches, they'll make this sound called piping. So they can find each other and then they'll fight. And if they're locked in a manner where they're both going to stab each other, they'll break and they'll go again. And then eventually there will be one. And at that point, that one will go out and hopefully get impregnated, come back. And at that point, the workers, they ignore her. Until she smells like she's been impregnated, they don't pay her any mind. They don't care. That's how a hive reproduces. Now, if she's just damaged or if she's not laying well, they may only make 1 or 2 of these. because they're not ready to swarm. They just want to replace her, you know. And so, but there's things you can do to facilitate. If she goes missing, if you were to have a box of brood, and that brood is where all the babies are, and you accidentally put it on a box that has just honey, now you've created this separation. The nurse bees will like, oh, where is she? Where is she? And the sound will change. They'll have this roar all of a sudden versus it sounds like more like an engine versus just a small AC going on because they're missing her. They can't smell her. They're freaking out. And at that point, they'll start facilitating what they need to do to start building a new queen, even though she's just down below. Okay. So there are multiple ways that you can do to raise new queens. Bee pollen is a ball or pellet of field gathered flower pollen packed by worker honeybees and used as a primary food source for the hive. Only baby bees, only larva eats pollen. It is the protein. Regular bees do not eat this stuff. They eat the honey, okay? Strangely enough, a large majority of our honey comes from China and has no pollen in it because USDA does not dictate what honey is. It's not definable. How do you have honey? Oh, and they also have to do pollination of a lot of their food by hand. What typically is happening, they're maybe getting some honey, they're cutting it with corn syrup, and they're selling it back as honey. There's ways you can figure out if it's honey or not. I'm not going to go through this class, but there's flavor. There's a way that it looks like they have what they call a lot of honey will have memory if you put it in water. There's a lot of, I can tell by flavor. Most honey has a musty aftertaste, at least kind of like champagne grapes or anything like that, kind of what I call an antique flavor. Mine has a different flavor because mine has pollen, because I don't use queen excluders, and I do foundation and I cut and strain. Therefore, I sell mine for more money because people who have allergies want as much pollen, and most of my honey has a pollen ring on top. Beside the point, the pollen also gives the honey a floral after flavor, which is different than what most people are used to. Anyway, so it consists of simple sugars, proteins, minerals, and vitamins, fatty acids, small percentage of other components, also called bee bread. So the bees, the pollen, they'll take the pollen and they'll mix it with the honey, and they'll make this stuff called bee bread, and that's what they feed to the younger bees. Or ambrosia. It's also stored in brood cells mixed with saliva and sealed with a drop of honey. Bee pollen is harvested as food for humans and marketed as having various health benefits. But pollen is not a concern in the winter. You don't really care because there's no babies, and they're not going to use it anyways. There is a beetle called small hive beetle. We like to name things. That anything that is fermenting, so like a compost heap, do not put next to beehives. But they'll go in and they love the pollen, and they'll lay their eggs and create these little larvae that just destroys everything, and it slimes. It leaves this slime stuff that the bees do not like to clean up. There's a microscopic view of pollen. If you ever thought that was kind of cool, I thought it was kind of cool. There's the chicken legs, as we like to call them. You can put this at the entrance, so as the bees go through it, it knocks the pollen off. You can collect it, but it still allows enough bees to go through and have pollen for their hive. I've never done pollen harvesting. It's not something no reason, I just have never gotten into it. I have enough pollen in my honey, so. Bees need both pollen and honey in order to reproduce. While adult bees eat honey, the bee larvae are dependent on a supply of nutrition, high protein pollen. Nurse bees consume the pollen in bee bread form, which then allows nurse bees to create the royal jelly in their mandibles that larvae need during the first 3 days of life. Then as larvae mature, they are switched over to a diet of bee bread and honey. So although the bees don't eat the pollen in the pure sense of the word eat, much of it does make its way through the digestive system at the end of the day. So, which class is this? Yeah. This is this 4-minute video. Like I said, this is for a homeschooling class. This is pretty cool. There's one of those almond orchards. You see it's barren over here.
Okay, time to head to work. But before this honeybee starts her commute, she's prepping for tools. Because honeybees collect pollen. You knew that. But it's not as simple as you might think. Plants want the bees to carry the pollen away and spread it to other flowers. That's pollination, how plants reproduce. But bees also need to carry lots of it home. Pollen is a protein-packed food for the hive. Luckily, they have the right gear. They're hairy, like tiny flying teddy bears. She's covered in 3 million hairs for trapping pollen. They're even on her eyes. Here on her legs, they're shaped into spiky brushes and flat combs. When she lands on a bloom, she really gets in there. Nibbling on the flower's anthers detaches the pollen. Time to pack up her haul. She cleans it off her eyes and antennae with those brushes on her front legs, like windshield wipers. Here it is up close. That leg wipes the pollen right off her eye. Then she moves the pollen from leg to leg, like a conveyor belt. Front to middle to back. The bee does this super fast while she flies from bloom to bloom, moving the pollen into special baskets on her back legs called corbiculae. She bends her leg, using it to squish the pollen into a ball, packing it together with a little saliva and nectar. She can get as many as 160,000 pollen grains into each ball. She's hauling as much as 1/3 of her weight. Back at the hive, meal prep is about to start. But the pollen isn't for making honey. The honey under this wax is made from nectar. They eat it for its sugar. Bees turn pollen into something completely different, bee bread. That's their source of protein. Step 1, find an open spot. Step 2, deposit your goods and pack them neatly. Step 3, let the pollen marinate with a hint of honey. And voila, it's ready. The pantry is stocked, both for adult bees and the babies that are growing in the cells next door. The adults pop in to drop off a special bee bread snack, a little home cooking for the hive's future hardworking flyers. Okay, more bees. We'll keep them coming. Bloop.
So one of the things they didn't cover in there is that while the bee is flying, he's generating, and you can think about it. Like, one of the reasons you don't touch helicopters at the pad is they have a lot of, especially in a storm, you've probably seen in movies, they have a lot of static electricity that's being built up during the process. Bees, as they fly, they build up static electricity with their wings, and it actually energizes their hair, so it sticks. And that's one of the reasons bumblebees are so furry, is for that same reason, for they build that static electricity, so they actually sticks right onto them. So we zoom in on here. There is tons of colors of honey and tons of flavors of honey, and anything that can produce anything that can produce nectar can be produced honey. There were some beekeepers that they went out to check their hives and they pulled out the frame and it looked like M&M's colors. Well, guess what was next to their hive later down the road? Well, it was an M&M factory. And so they were going and they were picking out these colors, and so, but yeah, and they each have their own flavor. I personally like dark honey because I like buckwheat. I like a rich honey. I do not like a sweet honey. Unfortunately, all I produce is very sweet honey. So people who like teas or sweetener or stuff like that, that's what they want. That's what I have. I personally think if I ate a spoonful of it, I would pucker because it's just like a kick in the face with the sweetness. It's just not my thing as much. But this is an old slide. This slide's probably about 10 years old, but give you an idea. The cost of honey per ounce at the time, I still sell my honey roughly $1.25 an ounce, which is expensive, I think, but because it has extra pollen in it, people use it for medicinal purposes. But you can see rare harvest New Zealand Manuka honey was almost $230. And like I said, these are old slides. Elvish honey is 1,742 per ounce, which is more than gold. So yeah, this is from 2021. Is more than gold. But the reason is because, and I'll read this because there's a lot of words up there. Elvish honey is the most expensive type of honey in the world today. Is also known as the true nectar of the gods. It is a honey that is thick in consistency, golden colored. What makes this honey so very rare and highly prized is that it comes from a cave that is located in the northeast part of Turkey, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, Sakarya Valley Cave. This is a very special cave. The Gunza Gune Turkish beekeepers keep this hive for the production of 100% pure and natural honey. The honey gets rich mineral content from the cave, which is first noticed in the year 2009. This is a deep cave that goes down over a mile in the earth. So can you imagine going down in a mile in the earth to beekeep? It's expensive to harvest the honey because it takes a team of mountaineers to descend into the depths of the cave where the honey is found. Another factor that makes the honey so highly prized is that it is created in an area that is populated with a variety of medicinal plants. Uses for honey: allergies, sore throats, herpes lesions, burns, memory, diabetes, cancers, wounds, bed ulcers, coughing, psoriasis. I've known people who've been on hospital boats that switched over from using used honey for burns instead of using other forms of antiseptics. And then we go to drone. So you can see the drone bees. They're these big old bulbous. These are workers. This type of comb. This is probably foundationless because I don't see anything on the bottom. The bees will typically leave a gap so they can go back and forth. Life of the drone bee. Drone bee cells are bigger than worker cells. We've already covered that. They have big eyes to see the queen, no stinger. Most drone bees, so they kind of go out to the bar. They fly out. They don't do any honey production. They fly out and they just kind of sit and wait for a queen. And they have these things called DCAs, and they just sit there, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And then all of a sudden, a queen shows up, and this is actually a drone bee that's caught a queen doing the dastardly deed, and then he dies. The amount of pressure that it takes for him to do the deed literally pops his insides out and he dies. So drone bees have a really kind of crappy life, although they get a winter eviction notice. So I can tell when winter's coming because the worker bees will chase all the drones out of the hive. Drones, for the most part, have to be fed. You will see them eating on occasion, but for the most part, they have to be fed. And the worker bees go, well, winter's coming, and we don't need you in here because we're not reproducing. We're going to kick you out, and you're going to die outside. And they chase all the drones out, and if they come back, they'll start ripping them apart. They'll start chasing them off, or whatever. So you think about it. As a drone bee, you either get lucky and die in the process, or you don't get lucky and come winter, you die. That's how it works. So this is a bunch of drones sitting on the landing board because the winter's there and there's nothing, they can't go back in. Now here's the thing though, if you open a hive in the winter and it's full of drones, what does that mean? What does he know about that hive? There's no queen. That's the problem, there's no queen. So my translation is you need to figure that out a lot sooner. But sometimes she may have died just recently, or your stupid butt squished her in the process because you decided to wear gloves and a bunch of protective gear rather than actually learn bee tai chi and try to not kill them. My opinion. So you see at the bottom of this, a bunch of cells. If you see this, that is a swarm cell. That doesn't mean they're reproducing. That doesn't typically mean that she's not laying well or she's injured. These are swarm. I become a kid in a candy store when I see this. Commercial beekeeping says destroy these, do whatever, take them out, dogmas, blah. For me, this is a new hive, that's a new hive, this is a new hive, that's a new hive, this is a new hive. Which means if I have, and I don't typically, but if I have 50% losses, I just cover my losses. Now, assuming this happens early enough in the season, I get excited. And because I have a foundationalist, normally there's a piece of plastic or something behind her. Because I'm foundationalist, I can literally take an X-Acto knife, cut this out, and use it to make a new hive. Okay, there are other things that need to be done. And here's the thing, they only make these type of cells when everything's perfect. You did not fail as a beekeeper. They have enough food and they're running out of space. That's not what a mistake looks like, which means these bees, queens here, have the most capability of being the best queens you can produce because they've been fed well and they weren't made in a rush. They were planned. And they typically do it at the bottom because they make these cups that face down so they can draw the queen in a vertical situation. Now, if the queen died right then and there and there's no cups and nothing, what they have to do is they have to take a worker cell and they have to build it out in an L. And then that queen is built, and the larva is built in an L. So she's kind of has this, I wouldn't call it deformity, but she's not as good as she could be. And normally what they'll do is if she has issues, she'll lay enough to create something like this, and then they'll succeed her and replace her anyways. So for me, I get excited when I see this. And if yeah, it's great because it takes care of my losses, plus I'm guaranteed the best queens I can get. I know how to manipulate the rest of the hive to set up a situation. And so, how does a colony reproduce? We talked about a swarm. Typically, the queen is hiding somewhere in the middle there. If you had a way of just plucking her out and putting her in a box and standing there, the pheromones will tell all. A few of them will notice. Once they land on there, they'll stick their butt up in the air. They'll flap their wings to push the pheromone like, hey, come over here, come over here. They have a gland called Nasonoff gland that puts off this smell that attracts them back. And then you just collect them all and walk out the door. You know. The nice thing about a swarm, most of the time, they are so fat with honey that they can't really bend their abdomens that well to sting you. So, and they're typically docile because they really just want to go somewhere. They want to go to a house. You know, they're not there to cause a problem. This is nice. The reason why this is nice is that if you have to buy bees, I think like a package of bees is now $200 some odd, just a package. And the thing is that when they sell packaged bees, they literally take a hive and shake out the worker bees, or the bees, not the queen, but shake them out, and then they'll raise a queen and they'll stick her in a box and stick her there. The two are not related, okay? And so what normally happens is that you'll put them in a box, you'll free them up, they'll come out, and the first thing they'll do is they'll come out of their box and they're like, hey, where's all the eggs? And the new queen is like, well, I'm getting around to getting cozy to start laying them. And so there's a 60% rate that they'll start succeeding her, start replacing a new queen that is theirs, that smell like their queen. But the problem is a queen, from the time you do everything that you need for her to hatch and start laying, is about 30 days. That's eternity here in the Midwest when you only have so much time to do it, okay? So in this situation, they are related to the queen. You get them for free, and they're probably not going to succeed her, okay? Maybe, because she's probably she's the older queen, but it's great if you can get that situation, and you get them free. There is tricks to hive swarm catching. There's enough research on YouTube to show you about it. It's not something I bother with, not that because it's not worth bothering, is that I typically don't have problems with producing more hives whenever I want to. So this is what a good frame looks like in a hive. Is you'll see these bands. There's a band here, there's a band here, and there's a band on the outside. So here's all your brood. This is the bee bread, because you got to have the food to feed the babies. And then the honey's on the outside, because you got to have a little bit of the honey to make the bee bread to fit the babies. And so that's what a good frame looks like. Queen cups are made, we talked about it briefly, made and laid in. They will become sealed queen cells after the old queen leaves. These cells, I'm going to spell that wrong, are called swarm cells, are normally found in the bottom of the frame. Scout bees leave the hive and find the acceptable place to swarm and then build a new hive. Nurse bees run out of work to do and stop feeding the queen. They run her around the hive to slim her down for flight. Older bees gorge themselves for honey, for resources for the new hive. Old queen leaves with the old bees. A good portion of the hive resources in the foragers and your harvest leaves. Once the scout found a new place to call home, they might stop in a few locations, times along the way. If somebody calls you and say, I got a swarm on my property, you want to go as soon as possible because normally they won't stay there very long. So you see how these are busted out of the side, right? This is the one that hatched, busted out of the top. She said, oh, I'm first, stabby, stab, stab. And then the worker bees will come and they'll rip the carcasses out of the side. Now, if you caught this in time, you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 queens that you could use, right? Now, the thing is the queen is not a guarantee. She can fly back, as people say, maybe 60, 70% of the time, everything works out fine, but she can get lost, she can get eaten by a bird, she maybe go to the wrong hive. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. But if you're trying to produce queens and there's a way to facilitate doing that, and your timing doesn't work, you've just lost all that effort. And you've also lost, let's see if this next slide, a lot of money. If the bee hatches in 2 different locations, they will make a special sound called piping. We've already talked about that, they find each other. That's them doing the Royal Rumble there. If you get queen pheromone, most of the time the queen will not sting the beekeeper because it's really not their nature. But if you've been handling queens and you smell like a queen, then she might sting your fingers, right? And so, the virgin queen, being the only queen in the hive, will leave the hive for multiple mating flights, and if and when she makes it back from her flight, she will smell like a queen and produce such pheromones, and be treated like a queen. If another mated queen shows up after this time, the queen will be balled up by killed by the worker bee. So basically, let's say you get 2 queens that never meet, and they both go out. One gets pregnant and comes back, smells impregnated. The other one comes back and smells impregnated. At that point, once they've already said the first one is their queen, they will ball the next one up, ball her up, and they will basically cook her, cut the air out, and kill her. She's done. And you can tell, one of the ways you can tell if your hive is queenless is you can take one of those new queens that you can buy that's in a little container, put them in there and see how they react. Are they trying to pet her? Are they trying to feed her? Or are they trying to get at her? So it's one of them. I don't buy pre-made queens. I don't ever really deal with the problem. But the only other time that a hive makes a queen cell is to replace an aging queen whose pheromones is drying up or she no longer is laying well. This is called supersedure. They will also make a new supersedure cells. Are not typically made in large groups on the bottom. They're just 1 or 2 off. They will also make a new queen if the old one is damaged, dead, or missing. This is called an emergency cell based on the cell location and the amount one can determine what is what. Because emergency cell will typically be made out from worker cell. Everything else is plant, So there's a whole bunch of different bees. You got American, Buckfast, Carniolas, Caucasians, Cordovas, Italians, Russians. There's a few more out there. These are generalities. By the time you typically get into beekeeping, you're going to get a mutt. Because here's the thing. When the queen goes out there, I've heard rumors up to 16 different drones, maybe from 16 different hives. And if you're buying like a Russian or something like that, they will try to isolate her ability to breed with certain drones. But what typically happens, it's elusive. If you were to say, I have these great genetics, and I have these bees that do well with Varroa. Okay, well, how well do they do with harvesting? Okay, now they do well with Varroa and harvesting. Are they aggressive? Now they do well and they're harvesting and aggressive. Can they talk to each other? Now they do well and they're aggressive and they can talk to each other. Do they overwinter well? So it's not like a cow or a pig. You have all these things because they produce all these pheromones. They're very complex. And once you get the right thing, it is hard to maintain. Because what happens is one of those traits become more aggressive. So bees, there are some bees that have a hygiene characteristics. If they smell a dying larva or if they know that larva is infested, they'll pull it out and they'll kill the Varroa. Well, when they try to do that, all of a sudden you have bees that go out there and just pull a bunch of baby bees and kill them all because they've gone overboard on that trait. So it's really hard to maintain traits. With that being said, this is one of the main things that I think all hobbyist beekeepers need to realize. You own the genetics of your bees. You control that genetics. You don't like it, replace it. You like it, make more of it. You need to own your genetics. Somebody goes, oh, I wear tons of gear because every time I go out there, all I do is get stung. Kill that queen, replace it. Break it down, new. Guess what happens to a large hive that's aggressive that is now 7 hives? They're not aggressive anymore. They're now the little guy on the totem pole. Or if she's still aggressive, replace her. Don't be afraid to own your genetics. I can tell you the most fulfilling thing I've ever done in beekeeping is raising queens. And I still remember, because the first queen that I raised, I marked her. I don't mark my queens anymore, but I marked her, and it was sloppy. And she literally, after I marked her, she rolled around and threw a temper tantrum on the ground. And I go, great, I got a drama queen. And she's laying there, she's trying to get it off, or she's pissed. And then finally, you can see her abdomen going down, like she's just like, is exhausted. Like, this is just stupid. And so she just laid there, and then all the other bees came over, like, oh, let's clean you up, let's take care of you. And she's just let them do their job. And I'm like, I'm not doing this again. I love this thing. And it's like, I own this. This bug, this genetics exists because I intervened. And I don't want to do this ever again. And I don't mark my bees. I'm not giving people a hard time that do. I understand why some people do. That's not something I do. Yeah, this is more of her length. So this I get giddy. See all these little rice things. One of the things I'll say a lot of times as a new beekeeper, if you see these rice, which is really the eggs, and you only see one in each cell, that's a good thing. That means she's been there at least within the last 3 days. And once you see that, you don't need to go looking for her anymore unless there's a reason you need to find her for some specific application. But if you want to know your hive's queen right, going into winter, just look for those. Now she will stop laying a little more come winter and stop altogether, but for the most part, that's a way to know if your hive is queen right. There's another. See, the color's changed a little bit. There's another queen. The traditional most used way queens are produced is by grafting. This is done by making a hive queenless. Okay, so you take a hive queenless, so now they want to raise a queen. And then giving them a bunch of artificial queen cells. Then removing the queen before they hatch and putting them in the mating nuke hive that are also queenless. Okay, I'll tell you what that means here in a minute. So what they do is they'll take a frame. Let's say this frame is full of baby bees. So once you see, royal jelly has a translucent shimmer, kind of like a mother of pearl color. If you can look down in the cell and you see that, but you really can't see anything in there, that's a really young larva. So what they'll do is they'll take this tool and they'll remove those individual larvae with the baby bees. They physically remove them out, and then they put them in these cups. Those cups are mounted in the hive vertically, so they draw them down. Okay. This is not how I do my queen raising. This requires too much labor, too much work. I have other ways. I just want to make enough queens to be sustainable. I'm not just breeding queens, even though that'd be kind of fun. Most people who do this type of stuff kind of see honey the way I do is just an expensive byproduct that pays for the other things you'd rather be doing with bees. A sticky, expensive byproduct. And so this is what they do. They insert that tool, they pick her up, and then they put her back into those individual cups. So they remove her out of the frame and put her back into the cups. You have to make sure you do it and pay attention to the way she's orientation because she has breathe holes. This is just a worker larva. This is not like a queen larva. You're transplanting worker larva into a queen cup, which they will feed royal jelly and she will treat as a queen. This is called grafting. This is what grafting looks like. So what they do is they'll take a hive, remove the queen, and now all they want to do is make queens. And then you take one of those frames of all your grafts, smack it in there, and they'll just draw them all out. Remember, this slide's 2021. 45 queens in the above picture. If all queens got bred well, then each queen could go for $25 to $40 each for a total of almost $2,000. This is a slide from 2021. The above frame. That's how you can make a crap ton of money beekeeping. It's not honey. And all that does is you just got to manipulate the hive to do it properly. And so what they do is that your queen, after you have to mate her. You can't you can sell her as a cell. That's why, but she's not worth as much. So what they'll do is they'll take those individual small little queen cells and they'll take just enough bees to put them in these little tiny hives called mating nukes. And then when she comes back and they're mated, then they're good to go. And that's how she gets impregnated. So it's just, that's all they have. So in these, you have just enough bees to take care of the queen. She comes back and starts laying, you can sell it. And these are actually nucleus hives. The nucleus hive is a hive that's just a small beehive. And people, you have the decision of buying the package, which we talked about earlier, or buying the nucleus hive. Of course, these are going to be more money. This is typically what I sell on occasion, are nucleus hives. Queen honeybee facts: the queen does not roll over the colony. She's just an egg-laying machine. A queen can mate up to 16 times, and once done, will stay pregnant for the rest of her life, which is 2 to 5 years. Once she's mated, she passes around queen pheromones that tell the bees that she's alive and well. The worker bees build the bee cells, and based on the cells, she will lay a drone or a worker in it. She does not feed herself. It is done by attendants. Okay, last part, problems facing bees. We talked this little, well, I'm not using the word, I don't know who's watching this. This is Varroa destructor. That is his Latin name, Varroa destructor. Whenever they use Latin for a word that means something pretty bad, it's typically pretty bad, okay? If you were a bee, this would be about the size of a basketball. It's a very large parasitic mite compared to its host. Varroa mite here, but here's the problem. Most of the Varroa mites feed underneath the bee, or they feed down inside this, or they go through the cell, which we saw. We'll watch a video here real quick. So a lot of people will say, well, I've never seen mites on my bees. You're not going to see them for the most part. And you will see them, baby bees hatching with deformed wings. You'll see issues. Sick bees don't work very well. They don't fly very well. They don't communicate very well. And come winter, they don't live.
We'd like to introduce you to the Varroa mite.
This is the one
Well,
part.
to be
If you
precise,
do not
we'd
learn
like
how
to
to manage
introduce
mites,
millions of
you will
Varroa
never
mites.
be able to keep
Why so many?
bees.
Well, when it comes to the Varroa mite, there's no such thing as just one. And if you'd like to see how an infestation starts, you need to look no further than your own bees, especially drones, as they're pretty social and like to travel between hives. Since Varroa mites don't have any wings of their own, they slip into hives by hitching a ride on the backs of adult bees. And for the lucky mite, the trip includes an in-flight meal, as Varroa mites will begin feeding on honeybees' fat body tissue within a few minutes of clinging to the bee. Once they've entered the hive, Varroa mites slip undetected into the vulnerable, uncapped brood cells. This is where the mites lay in wait until the bees cap the brood. Once a cell is capped, the mother mite, like a tiny spider, climbs atop the cocoon of the developing bee, tears open a hole, and begins to feed on its fat body tissue. Within 3 days, the mother mite lays her first egg, which always develops into a male. Then, she lays one female egg every 30 hours over the next week or so in her newly acquired home under the brood cap. And as each of these female mites mature, they mate with their brother. By the time the baby bee develops and leaves its infested cell, as many as 3 fertilized mites will emerge with it, and the cycle continues.
Because the bees draw their own wax, and my hives are foundationless, which they've been made bigger, they actually make smaller bees. It's called regression. If you catch a hive that's been wild for a while, their bees are actually smaller. That rate of how long that happens is shorter. So it's one of many things you can do to try to impact. On its own, it's not going to fix the problem. But it's one of many things you can do to start impacting the Varroa mite in your hive.
Using this strategy,
Here's
the
the
Varroa
problem.
mite population can grow as fast as the bee population it feeds on. But when summer ends and the bee
Boom, right there. So August here, at least in my apiary, I harvest all my honey in August and deal with Varroa mites until I don't have for a couple months. I have ways of dealing with it. I typically use something called oxalic acid, which is also, if you've ever, rhubarb is poisonous because there's a lot of it in the leaves. That's actually what the poison is. But you would have to eat, I forgot what it is, like 3 cups of kale or something stupid to have as much oxalic acid that I use in a hive. It's very minimal. What makes it dangerous to the mites is that you vaporize it. You do a thing called sublimation. That's when a solid turns directly into a gas. There's no in between. And then it recrystallizes in the hive. And it basically, and the theory is that all the joints, the soft parts on the Varroa mite, that they end up slicing them open and they end up bleeding out. They dry out. And that's how it kills them. So it's not so much the chemical as it's a mechanical means of dealing with it. In addition, oxalic acid is also organically in honey. So in Europe, it's not uncommon to treat and still have supers on, because it pretty much has a spike rate and then it kind of just levels off. And then they've tested honey and it's not any higher. So that's one of many ways is I use oxalic acid. But the problem is, if you see in August, if you don't start taking care of this issue before winter gets here, your hive is dead. Because at, I think they say 2% infestation rate, you're already having issues that your hive is already compromised. And you're like, well, how do I know if I have 2% infestation rate? there are ways you can test for your bees. One of the ways is that you can take a bunch of nurse bees, because they're the ones that are going to be most effective, because they're down there with the babies, and that's where the Varroa like to live. You can take a scoop of babies. I think it's like a cup is roughly, there's a certain number attached to it. And knowing that number of how many is in a cup, you can put, there's different ways of doing this. If you want to do what they call live testing, you can put powdered sugar in there and then shake it out. And that powdered sugar will shake the Varroa off, and you can basically use a screen where the bees don't come out, but the Varroa do. And you can count them in correspondence of how many baby bees you have. I recommend for all new beekeepers to be testing. And then eventually you'll get to a point as a beekeeper, you just go, I have them, I will always have them, I will make their life hell every time I show up. And that's my plan. I could really care less if they're infested or not. I'm always doing A and B and C, regardless. That's how I manage my hives. If you try to just treat them here, people, what they'll do is I'm putting a treatment here. Well, I know I treat them here, and then, wait, winter's coming, and they'll treat them here. Well, if you get hit in this position here, your hive, these bees in September are making their way to, they're the bees that are going to be living in November, December, and you don't have enough time to breed out healthy bees to make it through the winter. You could kill every single damn Varroa at the end of October, and it would make no change, no difference. Your hive's already screwed, because that infestation rate takes time for the queen to lay enough to have healthy bees to go in the winter. They say the fat bodies of what they're actually feeding on are kind of like your kidneys and your liver. They have a lot of things to do. It's not just fat on the bee. They're actually an organ that has a lot of
Population declines. The hive is left with a huge mite population.
That's death.
That's dangerous. Too many mites in a hive will overwhelm and kill entire bee colonies.
2%.
So what does that mean for everyone's favorite insect, the honeybee? Well, honeybee colonies with heavy mite infestations can't effectively pollinate or produce honey because they suffer from diseases and viruses transmitted by the mites. In fact, honeybees suffer from as many as 20 different mite-induced viruses, including the devastating deformed wing virus, which prevents them from flying. If you want to give your honeybees
and then they go to the neonicotinoids. This turned out not to be as big as a problem as people thought. Neonicotinoids is something that you can inject the tree with it, and for, I don't know, it's a systemic. It would stay for like 5 years, forever, killing anything that eats them. It turned out to not be the big problem as people thought it was. Or I should have said just mites are such a big issue. Facts about neonicotinoids, we'll kick over that. Most plants coming in the U.S. have neonicotinoids. Healthy honeybee forage, anything that would get you kicked out of a housing development is probably, or covenants or stuff is probably good for bees. As someone who's kind of dealt with that before in the past and stuff. Corn and soy looks like desert. Now, some soybeans, I believe, are moving to ones that are pollinated, which is kind of cool. But for the most part, there's nothing there for them to feed on. These are just food deserts, for lack of better terms. If the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left. No more bees, no more pollination, no more plants, no more animals, no more man. This is credited to Albert Einstein, but I don't think he really said it. Anyone who thinks they're too small to make a difference has never met a honeybee. There you have it. There's so much. Really, the takeaways you need as a new beekeeper is 1, buy 2 hives. Because you can always fix resources with 1. Buy 2 hives. And they'll act differently, even if they're the same breed. Just buy 2 hives. 2, learn how to make more queens. It's not black magic. There's ways that you can do it. Learn how to do it. And 3, figure out how you're going to deal with mites. I always tell people you need an ethos. You need something that works for you, but also means you have live bees. And people go, well, I'll never treat my bees. I'm going, you know how much dead bees make in honey at the end of the year? It doesn't matter if, they're natural, they're dead. Okay, great, you're a bee haver, you're not a beekeeper. So you want to actually keep your bees. And like I said, depending upon what type of bees you have, where you're at, you're going to hear different stories of what to do. I always say, don't trust a beekeeper with a clean jacket. If you see them on YouTube or Facebook and their jacket is not stained and just horrible, do not listen to them. Don't touch the beekeeper that says he knows bees well enough but won't work without gloves because he doesn't own his genetics. Now, in the South, they have Africanized honeybees, so things may be a little different. And just get someone some years underneath their belt, and everyone's gonna, but at the end of the day, you need to find out what works for you. Most beehives use deeps. This is a deep. They use deeps for the brood areas. I do not use deeps. These weigh a crap ton. As someone who spent a lot of time in the lifting iron games, I can tell you it's not worth it. This is what commercial beekeepers do. I do everything in mediums, which is what this is. This allows me to make nukes easier. It allows me to manipulate my hive easier. It allows me because normally what they'll do is they'll have a box full of these, and then they'll have supers, but if I want to create room, I gotta go find deep skin. Well, no, just make them universal. I'll use the same. There's ways that you can deal with swarms, that you can create space that allows you to create space using one size. And this is lighter, and they're still like 47, 48 pounds when they're getting close to full. I mean, they're heavier than that occasion. So I use mediums. Michael Bush uses mediums. I recommend mediums, especially if you're a boomer. You're not going to want to lift those things. We're talking about integrated pest management, talking about dealing with mites. That could be a whole separate class. The standard setup of a hive is you have the brood on the bottom, and people would call this a super. Super just means superimposed, because beekeeping uses stupid language. But if they would use supers, this is what people would use for honey on times. And then you have a cover that goes on top of this. You see how I got wax on here? This is to stop the bees from gluing your top down. That's a basic hive. Now this one has a screen bottom board. There's a screen on the bottom. That's kind of a cool way to check your mites, is that you can because when the mites fall off through the screen, they can't get back up. They're not very mobile. And so there's ways you can check for what they call mite drop. I don't really mess with it much anymore. This frame's probably about, this box probably about 15 years old almost. And I'm not going to get much into queen rearing, but there's this piece of sheet metal that's supposed to go on top of this, but this is the only tool I use for queen rearing. I use cloak boards. I use cloak boards and something called OTS in order to, we talked about how queens, if they get laid in an emergency, kind of L-shaped, and ideally you want cups to draw. If you were to take, this is an octagon shape here. If I was to take a hive tool, which is just like a knife, and break the bottom piece of the octagon with a larva in there, so you have this octagon. So now you break the bottom piece. This looks like a queen cell, just by busting the bottom piece. And the bees, when she's not in the hive, she will start drawing that out as a queen. And that allows you, when they're trying to replace the queen, it makes a break in that brood cycle, and the varroa have a tendency to not catch up as quick, and there's ways you can manage that. So I do have some honey here for you to try. If you haven't tried it before, I'm not sure if you guys, this here is the oxalic acid vaporizer. They do make them with DeWalt batteries. This is one I use a lithium pack, and I go out there. But the problem is that the varroa that are down in the cell, like we know they go in now, this cannot penetrate the top of that cell to get to them. So your best time to use this is when they don't have broods. It's going to be like late fall. But the problem is you're supposed to be treating for mice by then, or early spring. Or I use it like in a 5-day. I use it every 5 every 5 days to catch that hatching cycle. So I'm always catching them. Because this works. The oxalic acid is effective for about 3 days, is what most people are guessing in a hive. So I'm just trying to play catch up. There's other stuff I use. I use thermal. I use a bunch of other things. I use OTS on its own. That means on the spot queen rearing, and it's its own way of dealing with mites. And that's typically how I deal with mites, but it's an integrated pest system. It's not just I'm going to drop these chemicals in and hopefully it works. And my numbers are typically pretty good, or better than what I probably deserve. So, but that's it. That concludes it. So I know it's like a lot of drinking from the fire hose. You found the marble, right? Get on the horse and drink from the fire hose. UHF reference there. But it's, like I said, those 3 things. Mites, become sustainable, start growing it out so you can beat your numbers, and figure out how you want to overwinter. This is important. And that's That's it.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
So you got any questions, or I figured just kind of